for a get one by the slide. Okay, gotcha.
I can't see it, but I'll just have to strategically step out.
Oh, I've seen this series. We decided those were the ones. It's my country.
Yes, the honors night. I decided to do both. Honors night is the other. Because I can't.
Anyone?
Well, unless you guys are the experts.
You know everything we're going to learn.
It was these or the spiky ones. I don't know if you see the spiky ones. I'm wearing them during the honors night.
There you go.
Well done. So they get off. That's for both the kids. All right, we're about to start in a minute or so. Please, if you can, put your phones on silent, please, while the presentation's ongoing. I think this is maybe a record turnout for thesis. I think we have one person waiting on. Hold on for a second.
Kirsten's gonna stay up there.
Yeah,
He's gonna stay up there.
he's doing that.
Today is really kind of an all-star day for the Thesis Defenses. We have two of the finest projects I've worked on in the past several years. For those of you that are new to observing a Thesis Defense, this is our 20th year for this course and this activity. And again, we continue to produce some of the finest products and finest students that come out of this part of the country. Again, today's topics are very interesting, relevant, timely topics, looking at basically voter disenfranchisement for incarcerated citizens, as well as the queer liberation struggle. And again, two of our finest seniors in the class of 2022. We're going to leave here and, of course, go to our honors event afterwards. So, again, I think this is my 7th time to hear this presentation in the past 5 days. Again, it has been my pleasure this year to work with Rocky on this topic. I've got to bring in some new people to the committee in the process, and it's been exciting to work with them also. And without further ado, let's give it up for Rocky.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rocky Lowenthal, and today I'll be presenting my honors senior thesis, None of Us or All of Us, an analysis of intersectionality in the queer liberation movement. With a marked increase in legislative attacks on lesbian, gay, bisexual, and specifically transgender and queer rights over the last few years, I aimed to analyze the history of the queer liberation movement from before the Stonewall riots to the very beginning of 2022 in order to best determine how to prevent the further deterioration of LGBTQ+ rights. Now, I began my research by tracking the narrative of queer identities throughout history and found not only significant evidence of life outside the gender binary, but also beyond the heterosexist ideals that we have today. Furthermore, I found the impact of capitalism and the patriarchy on instituting the oppressions faced by marginalized groups. Now, my first chapter could not have been completed, much less started, without the incredible research and firsthand experience of Leslie Feinberg in her book, Transgender Warriors. Now, after researching the early movement for lesbian and gay rights, I shifted to the homophile movement. That was the homophile movement, and I then shifted to analyzing intersectionality after the Stonewall riots, as well as how this led to the alignment of the women's, Black, and queer liberation movements. Now, intersectionality, a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, refers to the unique experiences of people with multiple identities. Now, everyone experiences intersectionality, but those with multiple marginalized identities experience unique forms of oppression and discrimination because of this. Now, Crenshaw explained this with respect to the experiences of Black women who experience oppression differently than both white women and Black men. As such, for my second chapter, Crenshaw's demarginalizing the intersection of race and sex was essential. So I continued to the 1990s, where the queer liberation movement shifted to the political sphere and broke into two distinct factions based on their experiences of marginalization. And I've called these groups the queer movement and the lesbian and gay movement. And my key sources for this chapter were Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens by Kathy J. Cohen and Respectable Queerness by Dhirav Joshi. Now, my fourth chapter propels us into the 21st century, where we're currently witnessing the most significant attacks on queer rights ever. These headlines were way too easy to find. Now, for this and my policy recommendation, the Human Rights Campaign's Dismantling a Culture of Violence, as well as my interview with Amber Hikes, the Equity and Inclusion Director at the ACLU, were instrumental. I would also like to extend a very sincere thank you to Joyce Elliott and Anne Haley for their incredible contributions at the Human Rights Symposium, which I know a lot of you guys were at. And their contributions shaped not only which topics I covered, but also my understanding of how human these issues really are. So let's flash back to the 1950s, where the largest group advocating for gay rights was the Mattachine Society, which, as you see here, was led by mostly white, upper and middle class men. And as you might guess, they represent a tiny fraction of the LGBTQ plus community, which honestly at the time wasn't really a thing, since the groups in it, the homophile movement, didn't accept trans people or people of color. As such, the homophile movement did not have the capacity to keep up with the shift towards radical inclusivity of trans people, lesbians, people of color, and the working class. Now, the Lavender Scare and McCarthyism were two campaigns that worked to villainize homosexuals and communists, which did have significant overlaps due to the queer liberation movement's origins in Marxism. But this contributed significantly to the need for LGBTQ plus individuals to break away from passive resistance and shift towards radical action for social justice. And then, of course, in 1969, the Stonewall Riots broke out. This was not the first time the community had fought back. You might have heard of the Compton Cafeteria Riots in 1966. But the Stonewall Riots were certainly the most effective in making change and was the most remembered. Even before the night of the riots, police raids were frequent at the Stonewall Inn, which I should say was and continues to be a gay bar in the Greenwich Village of Lower Manhattan. And before the night of Stonewall, the general procedure would be that everyone would stop touching each other and they would leave the bar. But on the night of Stonewall, nobody moved. Now, after that, it's debated what happened, but we know that the people fought back. The gender nonconforming and trans patrons took the brunt of the punishment as usual, but this time a greater degree of violence was triggered. Stonewall was a moment in history that was decidedly a turning point towards liberation. And the riot was led by transgender women of color like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who you see just right there. And the Stonewall riots led to the creation of a variety of radical groups that aimed for the liberation of all. These groups included the Gay Liberation Front, the Gay Activists Alliance, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, and later ACT UP, which formed at the beginning of the AIDS crisis, and used Zap action techniques, which is basically embarrassing a public figure until they acknowledge the needs of the community. So these groups overlapped significantly with the Black Liberation Movement and the Women's Liberation Movement in the 1990s. Because there's no such thing as single-issue struggles, given the inherently intersectional nature of oppressions, these movements aligned over their experiences of marginalization. Black queer feminism, which highlights the gender, racial, and sexuality-based equity that these movements aim for, became a central theory of the time period. And while the movements certainly had their moments of misalignment, they exhibited significant rhetorical adjacency in the 1970s. For example, in the Bay Area, the movements were able to rally over the murders of gay or perceived gay men by the police, connecting over ideas of police brutality and the need for social equity. This alignment led to the recentering of the most marginalized in their work, in order to liberate society from the oppressive systems of white supremacy, the patriarchy, the gender binary, and many more. And this led to significant social change. However, with the dismantling of the Black Panther Party, a major group in the Black Liberation Movement, which collaborated significantly with the Gay Liberation Front, as well as the separation of the women's movement into regional groups, the queer liberation movement began to shift towards the political sphere, lose traction in the social sphere, and simultaneously began to factionalize. Now, due to debates over who should be included in the community, specifically over bisexuality and transness, as well as the pull of the political sphere for those closest to mainstream, led the queer liberation movement to split into two distinct factions. I've called these groups the queer movement, which aligns itself with liberationist goals, as well as the lesbian and gay movement, which advocated for more assimilationist ideals. The lesbian and gay movement, of course, advocated for pride, which seen by the queer movement as performative as opposed to creating real change to better LGBTQ plus rights. Now, both of these factions were challenged by the use of morality politics by the religious right. And that's because morality politics framed the advancement of LGBTQ plus rights as a moral and religious issue, while the lesbian and gay movement tried to use an identity politics model, and the queer movement used a broadened identity politics model. Sorry, the lesbian and gay movement used the interest group model. Now, the AIDS crisis was also responsible for turning the lesbian and gay movement towards respectability politics, which essentially served to minimize the role of someone's sexuality, if it's not heterosexual, and emphasize one's similarities to the mainstream. So the lesbian and gay movement, of course, managed to gain some traction in the political sphere and did pass the legalization of same-sex marriage in 2015. And while no one in the queer movement would likely say that we shouldn't legalize same-sex marriage, it was antithetical to liberationist goals because it follows strictly heteropatriarchal ideals and makes sexuality and interpersonal connections a legislative issue. So essentially, as the movement factionalized, it lost its momentum and the majority of its grassroots outreach, all while being represented more and more by white, affluent, cisgender gay men. And this became a problem because these people have fewer marginalized identities, which allows significant privilege and access in the political sphere. And with these people, such as Pete Buttigieg, heading the movement, it lost the majority of its momentum and no longer centralized intersectional experiences. Now, a factionalized movement stood at a much worse chance of defending against increased attacks from the religious right, televangelists, and organizations pretending to defend children when they are really just sexist, homophobic, transphobic, and racist. So this increase in legislative attacks on queer rights and physical attacks on queer rights began in the 2000s. So hate crimes or prejudice-motivated attacks rose dramatically, with 2021 seeing the highest level of reported crime over the last 12 years, while also being a record-breaking year for anti-LGBTQ plus legislation. Now, not only do hate crimes and legislation affect the queer community, but so does the current system of bullying, because it reproduces the cycle of harm created by societal structures. So the negative impacts on the LGBTQ plus community and its mental health start incredibly early. In terms of physical violence, LGBTQ plus people are also more likely to experience homelessness than their non-LGBTQ plus counterparts, which has high risk associated with it, including engagement in survival sex and negative altercations with the police. In terms of legislative attacks, the rights of trans people in particular have been under attack, including healthcare and religious exemption bills, sports bans, bathroom bills, and identification limitations. Religious exemption laws that reach to healthcare, like Florida's and of course Alabama's, allow healthcare providers to refuse to treat LGBTQ plus patients. Trans sports bans remove trans girls and women from female sports, even though this exclusion has shown to undermine team unity, and science has shown that there is no backing, there's no unfair advantage for trans girls in girls' sports. Furthermore, bathroom bills prevent trans people from going into the bathroom of the gender that they feel most comfortable with. And limitations on changing legal identification lead to discrepancies that impact virtually every aspect of life, including transportation, travel, housing, healthcare, education, employment, public accommodations, and even the right to vote, in exercising the right to vote, according to the Human Rights Campaign. The report also showed that nearly 1/3 of people whose name or gender don't match their IDs experience significant negative experiences such as harassment, physical assault, or denial of services. So, what can be done to address all of this legislation and increase in hate crimes? This needs to be addressed through additional legislation, education, individual, community, and grassroots action. Now, a lot of the legislation that I'm about to talk about is idealistic because it involves knowing that the current attacks on queer rights are detrimental. And obviously the people who passed them are not of that opinion. So this is why legislation and education must be simultaneous. And of course, nothing can be suggested, much less passed, without public support, which is why, in the end, it comes down to all of us. Now, in terms of legislation, the first and most obvious change should be undoing, blocking, and removing the legislation that I just talked about. Some action is currently being taken towards this, including the ACLU's lawsuit against states such as ours. And beyond that, legislation that advances LGBTQ+ rights and recenters intersectionality so that we can experience more social progress spans in a variety of different directions. One of the first things that comes to my mind is ending conversion therapy. Now, conversion therapy is the process of forcibly trying to change someone's gender or sexuality. And not only does it not work, but is incredibly detrimental and sends a message of deep familial rejection to the people who are forced to endure it. Queer youth who are rejected by their families are 8 times more likely to have attempted suicide, 6 times more likely to report high levels of depression, more than 3 times as likely to use illegal drugs, and more than 3 times as likely to be at high risk for HIV and STIs than their counterparts who are accepted by their families. And in line with this, it's crucial to expand and protect mental health services for LGBTQ+ people, especially queer youth. This is especially important for LGBTQ+ specific care like hormones for trans people, but also for in general because of queer specific discrimination. These teens in Arkansas, including Zara Banks, had significant mental health detriments due to this legislation. She said, "It comes to me being a Black trans girl living in a place that doesn't accept me. I know one thing, that when I'm able to, I will not be here anymore." Her experiences reflect that of many other queer teens in states with anti-LGBTQ+ legislation, and shows the need for mental health services to help support these youth. Furthermore, a 2009 survey of middle and high school students by the Center for American Progress found that 85% of LGBTQ+ teens experience being verbally harassed for their sexual orientation, and nearly 2/3 for their gender expression. Now, queer students have significantly poorer mental health than their non-queer counterparts, and it's thus even more important to ensure that they have access to supportive mental health services. Now, the next change is expanding non-discrimination policies throughout the private sphere, as well as addressing the gender and race pay gap, and workplace culture. Now, by taking a legislative stance by protecting the most marginalized in the community, the social narrative will begin to shift. And while non-discrimination policies alone will not completely protect people, it will help limit overt discrimination. Now, this also involves making legal identification changes easier and less expensive, so that people can be, not only so that they can be represented by their IDs, but so that they can also be safer when interacting with their employers and the police. According to a 2020 study of trans participants from Massachusetts and Rhode Island, legal gender affirmation strongly correlates to lower reports of depression and anxiety in general and when faced with gender-based mistreatment. Now, the next legislative change that is incredibly important for the queer community is the decriminalization of sex work. LGBTQ+, and specifically trans people, as well as people of color, are much more likely to experience homelessness, as I said, and in turn, while they're experiencing homelessness, are more likely to engage in survival sex, or sex work in order to make ends meet. Now, not only is this type of sex work a last resort, but it is also criminalized, leading to a generational cycle of poverty, incarceration, and violence, especially due to the impact of the police. Around 85% of trans respondents to a 2015 survey reported being harassed, attacked, sexually assaulted, or mistreated in some other way by the police when they were thought to be doing or were doing sex work. Now, decriminalization needs to be at the forefront as opposed to legalization, because while we do need to extend the same legal protections, it's imperative to avoid protecting sex trafficking. Now, this would also allow sex workers to engage in survival sex in a safer work environment, as well as allowing them to transition to other forms of work that are much less violent. Now, these were just a few legislative changes that will not only recenter intersectional experiences, but that will seek to rectify current inequalities and push us toward the path of liberation. Now, as I mentioned, legislative changes cannot be made without educational changes. These must include increasing acceptance and by spreading information about LGBTQ+ identities, and by increasing visibility of intersectional queer experiences in the media. So this includes not only not banning books such as these that center queer characters and characters of color, but also that means seeking them out on an individual basis and promoting them in your community. This education, however, is not just for individuals, families, and communities, but it also has to be expanded to educating lawmakers, law enforcement, and healthcare providers. And this education in particular must be culturally competent, which means that it takes a stance that is open to others regardless of their identity and interacting with them in a way that is respectful of their culture and traditions. For lawmakers, this means not making laws that marginalize their constituents, and also listening to the experiences of their constituents without personal bias. This is much easier said than done since beliefs are incredibly difficult to change, which is why this has to be taught in schools on the front end and emphasized by the public. For law enforcement, this means anti-bias training, de-escalation training, and a reinvestment in communities instead of increasing police presence. Because policing and the incarceral system is inherently based in white supremacy, these reforms can only do so much to help these marginalized communities, but they're an integral starting point to help decrease the negative impacts of over-policing. And for healthcare workers, this means understanding the unique experiences faced by queer people, especially those of multiple marginalized identities. And they can help treat these people by being open to their identities and ensuring that they are treated with kindness, dignity, and respect. As a first step, it's really that simple, and it's honestly appalling that this isn't already the norm. And finally, none of this can be done without individual, community, and grassroots action. The role of the individual and the community in advocacy has never been more important. In particular, elevating marginalized voices within conversations, creating safe spaces in schools and community areas, and working to make homeless shelters more inclusive are all important actions that can be done on a community level. And in addition to these changes, community members should actively try to engage in discussions surrounding workplace discrimination to mitigate it, and should work to change the narrative surrounding mental health, queer identities, and sex work through open conversations and active self-education. While this won't change the national narrative immediately, it is such an important start, and it begins with us. Furthermore, queer voices should be explicitly included in conversations regarding sexual health and assault in schools and community programs in order to not only demonstrate support, but also to ensure that different perspectives and types of reproductive health and experiences are covered. These legislative and physical attacks of the last few years are currently defining the future of millions of people across the United States. But we can change that. The future of the queer liberation movement is defined by what we do, and we must recenter intersectionality in order to liberate each and every one of us from the oppressive systems that rule our lives. In this world, it's none of us or all of us. Thank you.
Why has there been so much contemporary backlash? Has there been something that has triggered this? Is it just the success the movement's had in recent years? What is happening? Why has our society become so much more toxic in the past 5 to 10 years?
Well, in part, it can be seen as after the lesbian and gay movement managed to legalize same-sex marriage, it's kind of the same pushback after the Obama administration. You kind of saw a rise in anti-Black hate crimes. It's similar in that way. We see a rise because of the successes of the lesbian and gay movement, but it's also because, I believe, because of the successes that the Trump administration managed to have in pushing some pretty significant religiously motivated, typically religiously right-motivated conservative policies. And so given a little bit of precedent, it can just explode in that fashion.
One other question that I'm going to push down to my committee members here. What impact has media had on, making this narrative so toxic within our culture?
Yeah, so media in terms of visibility is something really interesting because while media has been a toxic force in the last few years, it's also been a really important and powerful one for queer youth, right? Seeing yourself reflected in other people is just beyond a powerful experience. And seeing not just on like Instagram or anything, but in the New York Times, seeing articles like that, the media in recent years with the rise in legislative attacks has been detrimental to queer mental health because of the negative repercussions of this and how widespread it is. I mean, you see it one day, it happens one day, you see it immediately after. But this visibility is more prevalent than ever in generally a positive way.
I'll turn it over down the aisle here.
I'm not ready yet, go ahead. Well, I appreciate the historical context a lot. So as somebody who is a history teacher, what do you feel is the relationship between the successes and your failures? And I know you outlined this some, but I guess I'm going to look backward and then forward to ask you if you think there's a direct cause and effect relationship, or what you think that relationship is, if you think there's a different type of relationship between the political pendulum that exists historically in the United States and the different types of legislation. And the second part of that question is, what do you think that relationship, I mean, I'm asking you for the future, but what do you feel like the most positive future could look like?
Right. So in terms of the first part, historical political trends have been super influential for the movement. With the decline of the New Left, that actually led to a significant decline in power of the queer movement, the power side. Black power, queer power is modeled after that one. So the decline of the New Left made that one less of a possibility because of the idea of compromises. And so with that idea of compromises came legislation. The lesbian gay movement would try to propose legislation that would benefit them, but then with compromises, you basically reset back to zero, and then you try, and then with the increase in, I'm going to skip to the Trump era, if you will. Then with the increase in prevalence of conservative parties in the media and just the legislative sphere, it has strongly influenced not only the backlash from the queer liberation movement, really the queer movement, but has also influenced, of course, the original legislation and future legislation. And in terms of what happens in the future, I think the best possible option or best possible experience is learning from like the Black Lives Matter protests and everything that's gone on in the last 3 years. Learning and unlearning. Certainly unlearning prejudices, and this needs to happen. When I was talking about education, I think that's the most important thing for lawmakers and future lawmakers, because if you understand the detriments that these laws that you're trying to pass have, then hopefully you won't pass them, right? So ideally, the future looks like a much more educated governmental body that actually acts with the ideas of the populace in mind. That kind of goes into Harrison's topic, like representative democracy.
Yeah. So I love that because as an educator, I want to believe this, but I think it's true that education is deterministic. And I like your argument that the type of society you have and the way that your society is educated directly determines what type of society you have in the future.
And that, of course, is a slow change. You can't just present here. Can you guys read my thesis and then undo the legislation? It's not quite that direct, but it will take some time. But I think that is a possibility.
All big positive changes.
Yeah.
Most.
Rocky, I loved reading your paper because, one of the reasons I loved reading your paper was because it's all about people. It's so easy to hate this type of person when I don't know one. And your paper included so much good narrative and anecdote and ethnobiographical and quotations and firsthand accounts. And as well as the presentation today, I really appreciated the images of those 3 trans teens that you said they're from Arkansas.
One of them was definitely from Fayetteville, but I don't remember where else they were from in Arkansas.
So my question is, I'm the arts educator in this panel, and I'm going to ask the touchy-feely question. Who did you fall in love with in this project? Whose story did you just,
Well, the very first one that I read was Leslie Feinberg's. I tried to reach out to her partner. I guess that didn't come to fruition. And then I was like, what if I translated her book into Spanish? And then, so I just went down a rabbit hole there in Feinberg's life. I just loved everything that they've done, and just a really inspirational figure. So
You're overthinking that. Remember that we reeled that in.
And there are two things, like the pamphlet and the book. So I was just over there like switching them out.
So I have a question, and I really enjoyed everything of the writing of that, but it's over, defended it,
Yes.
you're good. What are you gonna do next to make a difference?
That's an excellent question. So I'm hoping, so I mentioned the ACLU a couple times in this presentation. I did an interview with Amber Hikes, and they've just been an incredible inspiration for me. And so I was hoping to either work with them this summer. ACLU of Arkansas has 5 full-time staff members, whereas I believe California has 200 or 500. Something like that.
More than that.
Well, they split it into 3. There's
Oh,
3 ACLUs in California. So I thought that would be a pretty interesting thing to do. But also Lucy's Place. We had them speak. Ex Freelon was just an amazing speaker at the Human Rights Symposium. So I thought that would be a really great way to not only connect with the Arkansas community before I move away, but also a way to really directly address the impacts of homelessness on queer youth.
Lucy's Place really needs help. They do.
Yes,
And they would appreciate it.
I love it. So, yeah,
Rocky, you've done a fantastic job.
thank you.
I love the organization. You're so thorough. One of the best policy rec sections that I've seen. So congratulations on that. I'm wondering, you talk about the religious right and some of the moral high ground. Is there an argument that can be made? We've had the recent, don't say get the gay bills passed and things like that. Is there an argument that can be made to that demographic that will help to lend support to the LGBTQ plus community?
Honestly, I don't know. In the Human Rights Symposium panel, that question was asked to Ex Freelon, and they responded like, people who don't want to learn won't learn. And that's kind of just the reality of the world we live in, and that's not like a just wait for them to die out argument, like not at all. Unless it's, but I do think that by increasing the voices of queer people, you start to realize, like Mr. Willow said, this is a human issue. This is a human topic. These are real people. And I think when arguing being gay is wrong, right, you're arguing something that's not grounded in reality. You don't see the people that it impacts. And so by increasing visibility and just the voices of queer people in the political sphere could actually, especially queer people with multiple marginalized identities, I think, I'm not saying like exposure therapy, but like kind of something like that.
I know we have some questions from this large audience out here. We have about 5 minutes for questions.
All right, so I have this question just because I've been following your paper during the whole year, right? It's been an amazing journey, and you talked in your paper about the impact that southern states have on this type of stuff, but you never really talked about the northern aspect of it. So I was wondering if comparatively, how is the north compared to the south? Like this state is not great.
Right. So because of the history of kind of the north-south divide, that's why we're seeing more anti-queer legislation in the South. But in terms of kind of conversion therapy, for one, I found that we don't really know where it's centralized. Like, it's not just in the South, it's not just in the North, it's everywhere in the United States, and it's not reported to the extent that we actually can figure out where it's happening and address it. And so the North, after the Civil War and the African Americans started migrating north, it became evident that people in the North were just as racist as people in the South, but just didn't have like the type of the political angle for it. So I think that's probably got to do with it, kind of that parallel there. But also the argument that education and society are interconnected. I think I'm using choosing colleges, and so I was looking at UChicago's Center of Equity and Inclusion, and I was looking at Vanderbilt's, and Vanderbilt's a great school. I should have but it was very different what they emphasized. And so when you're educating people on queer topics, and I think that happens more in societies, in cities, in New York, LA, places where you're experiencing diversity every single day, you're more likely to have an accepting community that probably doesn't pass such terrible laws. So, and of course the opposite. Sarah?
So you talked about how there's a rift that was created between the lesbian and gay movement and then the queer liberation movement. So do you think that was because the lesbian and gay movement might have become victim to recuperation by everyone else, or just because it happened?
I think in part the shift happened because lesbian and gays were more targeted based on their sexuality, which is something they could hide, right? So that was part of respectability politics due to the AIDS crisis. And that was why they started going after marriage so much. It was one of the reasons they started trying to push for marriage. Whereas the queer movement acknowledged these systems to, like marriage to be part of the oppressive systems that, govern, like dictated how they were marginalized. But I definitely think recuperation is part of it, if not a significant part of it.
Welcome to upper school, by the way.
You want to follow me for sure?
Oh, you can. I mean, just
Justin.
What do you think infighting, like with TERFs and
Yeah.
like the drop the T movement?
Right.
What do you think the effect of infighting is on the public's perception of the whole queer movement?
That's a great question, because that's one of the things that contributed to me. Like, when I did my research, I didn't actually see anyone arguing that there was factionalization. Like, that word literally never came up in my research. And then I looked up factionalization, and then I looked up this, and I was like, so I think that has a pretty significant meaning for what we're experiencing right now. We're experiencing a more significant rift in the movement than ever. Like, like trans and queer people on kind of one side of the spectrum and lesbians and gays on the other side of the spectrum becomes a really interesting issue, especially with media, because trans people are more vilified in the media, made the laughing stock, whereas gay people are kind of just like put in the background, like, I don't know, in Marvel or something. I don't know if that's a terrible example, but they can be part of society without being important. Whereas trans people tend to be more visible. And so I think that tends to skew a more negative perception towards trans people than lesbian and gay people, or people whose sexuality is of course not heterosexual. And I think this rift it's not unfixable, but it is definitely something that needs to be addressed in the near future of the movement for us to be able to even recenter intersectionality at all. Lila?
I know you touched a little bit on education, and so I was just wondering if you could expand on specifics that we can do in schools to make a difference of just how it's perceived and how people feel. I know you were talking about making sure that it's a comfortable and inclusive space, but even beyond that, as far as educating people.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I did this year was I looked at PA's dress code. And I found that it separated it pretty significantly. Boys can wear this, girls can wear this. One of the things that needs to happen is addressing issues in administration, on the front end, so that your school can even be an accepting environment, right? And then this also involves educating people, but in a way that integrates education into classroom experiences. So that's not just hey, by the way, there was the Stonewall riots, they were really interesting. It's more, queer people have always been a part of this nation's history, have always made significant contributions, and I mean, in terms of America-centric education, they are American. They are, they should just be integrated into history courses. It's not now we're into queer history. It should be part of it. And I think by doing that, it also normalizes this. It doesn't other groups, which significantly, leads to more divides. So I think that's one really important thing.
last question. Go ahead.
You choose. I can't choose.
Me? Oh, thank you. So going back to Mr. Willis's point of if you don't know one, it's easy to hate one.
Right.
I think especially for sex workers, but more specifically trans or anybody who's a part of the LGBTQ plus community, sex workers, it's easy to subconsciously dehumanize them. And especially because you don't actively see them in your everyday life, it really is easy to do so. So aside from educating yourself, how would you recommend breaking down those personal discriminations? Not necessarily for ourselves, but other people as well.
That's absolutely an amazing question. I think possibly exposure has something to do with it, just becoming familiar with the real, like just talking to people. In my research, I had quite a few, I didn't actually do personal interviews with these people, but I found in a lot of my articles, there were personal narratives of people who, were survivors of sex work. They had previously engaged in survival sex, and they talked about, and you mentioned dehumanization, which is really interesting because when talking about sex work, especially survival sex, it becomes a question of, is any type of survival sex actually voluntary if you have no other options? And so that type of dehumanization can actually be internalized by the sex workers themselves. So in the actual narratives that I read, it was people recounting their experiences both in order to survive and in order to, recover from that. And so learning, first of all, that sex work is real work, right? Like, it's work. And also learning that these are real people with real experiences. These people are just like us and have had different situations, right? And I think that's the most important part in changing not only the social narrative, but your own perspective.
All right. Those, yeah. Committee members, let's get a quick photo, and we'll whoever's exiting.
Slide or the first slide?
Yeah, let's go to the first slide.
First slide's kind of busy, but.
Was it? Yep.
That is the perfect time. Right?
All right.
You're already tall. You're already
How
tall.
you doing?
Yes, Ms. King. Ms. King, do you want your chair to stay back there, or do you want?
Thank you.
Get one across the
Ross, so much. All this happened.
That question was really good.
I do every time I talk
I definitely went on a lot of that.
And that's what I'm saying, like, you like, you got the rabbit and you go down, you black out, you don't realize it's so like, I don't think because
so
the key is my teacher. I have We did. I'm on it.
First thing you can do is clean your room. Good luck, Harrison.
Wow.
Thank you.
Yeah, she just stepped on us.
We're out of chairs again. Wow. I mean, this is like a music festival. Academics involved instead. Yeah, she's right off for a second. Cool. Anyone ever doubted the academic excellence of this place? If you were in here, what's coming up, you just saw, we are, there's no competition out there. So it's not even close. These are some of the finest projects I've seen in the 20 years we've been doing senior honors thesis. It is great to have our new president on board on this thesis topic. New faculty members, everyone gets involved. We have teachers all the way from lower school, all the way through high school involved, administrators across the board. So this is an awesome experience. I was reminiscing about Harrison a minute ago because I was having 9th grade presentations last period, and I was shaking my head thinking, man, I need a Preeti Adala, I need a Harrison McCarty in this 9th grade class because I wasn't saying it, but maybe I have nostalgia for 4 years ago when they were 9th graders. But Harrison, I knew he wanted to do a topic that was something that he was passionate about, and he is going to, kill it wherever he's going to college next year. One of the finest students that I've ever encountered in my 30-year teaching career. I think you will truly enjoy this impactful presentation. Let's give it up for Harrison.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Harrison McCarty, and thank you for attending my senior thesis defense for Barred from the Vote, Felony Disenfranchisement and its Intersections with Race in Class. Is the United States truly a democracy? What was introduced to all of us in this room as a seemingly elementary concept has now evolved into one of the most complex philosophical questions of the modern era. The purpose of this thesis is to answer that question and to examine how felony disenfranchisement impacts our democracy and the ways in which it upholds racist systems from the past and the ways in which it promotes inequality today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge some of the sources that were fundamental in crafting this project. First and foremost, Democracy in One Book or Less by David Litt was the catalyst for this project and what inspired me to take on felony disenfranchisement. Secondly, Locked Out by Jeff Monza and Christopher Ugin is a seminal work when it comes to felony disenfranchisement, and it provided me with an understanding of many important concepts, ideas, and statistics. Additionally, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander was the cornerstone of my first chapter and helped me understand how felony disenfranchisement was used to uphold racial power structures. Finally, the Sentencing Project and the Brennan Center were two important think tanks that helped me understand what felony disenfranchisement looks like in the 21st century. Additionally, I had the awesome opportunity to speak with two experts in the field. Kimberly Haven, who's a returned citizen, which is an individual who is charged with a felony but has completed their sentence, works in Maryland with her organization, Maryland's Got Democracy. Haven worked with other returned citizens to make Maryland's felony disenfranchisement laws to be more inclusive of returned citizens. I also got the opportunities to speak with Dr. Neil Sukhotme, who works with returned citizens in Florida to help them access the ballot box and to make sure their right to vote is protected. So, how did we get here? Where are the origins of felony disenfranchisement? Well, on April 9th, 1865, the Civil War ended, finally ending slavery throughout the entire country logistically. Racial threat theory states that when one racial group holds power over another, and they see that the subordinate group is starting to gain traction over them, they will do everything they can to maintain this power structure. In America, this took form in the place of black codes, which were laws that disproportionately punished individuals for petty crimes such as vagrancy, loitering, or public drunkenness. As I've alluded to, black codes were a response to the perceived threat to power that free black individuals presented. By criminalizing deeds common to low-income and minority populations, redeemers, who were individuals that wanted to uphold white power, succeeded in re-enslaving black people and using their labor in the prison lease system. Across the country, legislators began to adopt policies that targeted black individuals, with one redeemer from Alabama stating that the crime of wife beating alone should disqualify 60% of the Negroes. Additionally, later on, we see the passage of the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. The 14th Amendment extended citizenship to all males regardless of their race, and therefore voting rights. And the 15th Amendment was basically reaffirmed that voting rights were inherent to citizenship. We also see Congress pass the Military Reconstruction Act and the KKK Act, which protected Black individuals at the polls. As more and more Black voters headed to the polls and many forms of voter suppression becoming illegal across the country, state governments that wanted to disenfranchise Black individuals thus had to turn to codified disenfranchisement, leading us to our current felony disenfranchisement paradigm that we see today. What's important to remember is that these laws maintained well into the 1970s, 80s, and even today. So when in June of 1971, President Richard Nixon announced a new war effort known as the War on Drugs, we see felony disenfranchisement become more impactful than ever. It was not until the Reagan administration, though, that the war on drugs truly reached its peak. The war on drugs led to the militarization and massive expansion of America's policing system due to the ways in which funding was distributed. It was a quantity over quality approach, meaning that police forces were encouraged to go after low income and communities of color that had lower social capital and therefore were easier to make arrests in. This led to 2% of America's entire Black population being incarcerated in 1999. As I alluded to, throughout this massive expansion of America's prison system, the archaic felony disenfranchisement laws that were established during Reconstruction stood in place, disenfranchising many Americans. So where are we now? What is the current state of felony disenfranchisement? Well, across the country, there are four main systems of felony disenfranchisement. On one end of the spectrum, we have universal voting rights, regardless of one's relationship with the incarceral system. This is only in place in Puerto Rico, DC, and the two states of Maine and Vermont. On the other end of the spectrum, there are 11 states that introduce additional obstacles to voting after an individual has completed their sentence. These could come in the forms of a mandatory waiting period, payment of court fees, fines, and restitutions, or just permanent disenfranchisement. Due to these laws, we see that 3% of all American voters are disenfranchised because they have a former or current felony conviction. Although this may not sound like a notable amount, what's important to remember is that individual voters do not elect representatives. It is groups of voters. Additionally, of the 5.2 million Americans that are kept from voting, 3/4 are no longer incarcerated. They're either on probation, parole, or have completed sentencing entirely. Additionally, felony disenfranchisement has kept more than 7% of the entire Black population in America from voting, which is a staggering amount that could change the result of any election. Ultimately, this policy disproportionately impacts low-income and minority voters, two demographics that are key bases for the Democratic Party. Thus, it has become beneficial for the Republican Party to systematically work to demobilize the Democratic Party's base by protecting and expanding felony disenfranchisement. Demobilization politics, however, is antithetical to American democracy. It's a threat to our systems and institutions. Felony disenfranchisement, however, is not just held up in legislatures. It's held up in the judiciary as well. In 1898, the Supreme Court heard its first case on felony disenfranchisement, in which the plaintiffs argued that Mississippi's felony disenfranchisement codes were in direct conflict with the newly passed 14th Amendment. While the court acknowledged that Mississippi had obstructed voting by targeting certain peculiarities of habit, of temperament, and of character, they stopped short of actually striking down this law. Although this is unsatisfying to the 21st century listener, it proved to be an important precedent that would play out nearly a century later. In 1974, the Supreme Court heard the seminal case on felony disenfranchisement in Richardson v. Ramirez. On May 31st, 1972, Abram Ramirez, Larry Gill, and Richard Lee filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of every returned citizen in the state of California, arguing that the state had infringed upon their constitutional rights to vote by withholding the ballot from them after they had completed probation and parole. After working its way through the court system, the Supreme Court eventually ruled against the men on the basis that the 14th Amendment allows for disenfranchisement for participation in rebellion or other crimes. A decade after the Richardson case, which proves to be the standing that the court promotes to this day, it heard one final case, Hunter v. Underwood. The court struck down a provision of Alabama's felony disenfranchisement laws in this case due to the fact that it clearly targeted African American voters. So this took the precedent set in Williams v. Mississippi that ostensibly neutral codes could be used to target vulnerable populations and applied it to Alabama, saying that the ostensibly race-neutral codes of their felony disenfranchisement was meant to target African-American voters. To this day, this is the only time the court has struck down a felony disenfranchisement provision. However, why does this matter? Well, first and foremost, felony disenfranchisement will lead to a loss of legitimacy and trust within our government, as more and more individuals will have less and less say in our government. Additionally, it is leading to the rise of what is known as prison gerrymandering, a system in which when an individual is sent to prison, they're counted within the district of the prison instead of their home district, thereby increasing the representation of the overwhelmingly white rural districts that host prisons, making our representative democracy not as representative as we truly think it is. Additionally, and in my opinion, most importantly, it's impacting our local elections. It's easy to forget in discussions such as these that it is on the state and local level that we are the most impacted every day. One returned citizen spoke to this fact, saying, quote, "I have no right to vote on the school referendum that will affect my children. I have no right to vote on how my taxes will be paid, which I have to pay whether I'm a felon or not. So basically, I've lost all voice or control over my government. I get mad because I can't say anything because I don't have a voice. This is antithetical to the very existence of America." But what do all these ideas and concepts that I've introduced actually look like when in practice? To answer that question, I turn to the three states of Vermont, Arkansas, and Florida. Vermont is unique in the terms of felony disenfranchisement, as it is one of only 2 states that has universal voting rights. Additionally, Vermont was the first political entity in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. I do not believe that this is a coincidence. Today, Vermont also boasts extremely low incarceration rates, with only 1,189 individuals being charged with a felony in the state. Despite allowing individuals incarcerated to vote, only about a third of inmates are actually registered, and of that third, only around 9% actually turn up on election day. Why is this? Well, I attribute it to 3 main reasons. First, Vermont relies on volunteer organizations to register individuals for, organize, and administer their elections, which is unreliable and undependable. Second, 20% of Vermont's prison population has less than a high school degree, and some studies estimate that up to 60% of the prison population is illiterate, making voting seem unnecessary and unimportant. And finally, there are a lack of resources within prisons to learn about upcoming elections and to build excitement around voting, therefore making individuals feel more apathetic when it comes to it. Arkansas introduces an entirely different model than Vermont. Arkansas was a massive slave state, so when emancipation and the passage of felony disenfranchisement provisions swept the nation, Arkansas joined in. Today, 87,000 Arkansans, or 3% of our state total, are disenfranchised due to our felony disenfranchisement provisions. Of the 3%, over half are no longer incarcerated. 27,000 are on parole and 42,000 are on probation. Additionally, considering that 42% of Arkansas's prison population is Black, we can estimate that 36,540 Black Arkansans are kept from voting due to such laws. This is disproportional to how many Black Arkansans there are. Additionally, Arkansas operates under a system in which, in order to be re-enfranchised, an individual has to complete their sentence, probation, parole, and pay all court fees, fines, and restitution. This is known as felony financial disenfranchisement. What's particularly concerning about this is that 27% of formerly incarcerated individuals are unemployed, and of those that are employed, most are only earning just above the national poverty line of $15,000 per year, making paying off these debts unlikely. Finally, any discussion of felony disenfranchisement without mentioning Florida is truly incomplete. Florida is notorious for their harsh classifications of felonies, and they label more crimes as felonies than any other state in the nation. Additionally, before 2018, Florida was one of the few states that practiced permanent disenfranchisement, leading to a third of the entire disenfranchised population living in the state before 2018. That was until Amendment 4 campaign and the work of Desmond Meade. In 2018, Meade and his grassroots coalition began to advocate for a provision to Florida's constitution that would change Florida's constitution to return suffrage after an individual had executed a completed sentence. While it did pass with 64.5% of the vote on election day, in June of 2019, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed a bill into law that defined completed sentence as also having paid all court fees, fines, and restitution. So felony financial disenfranchisement like Arkansas. This is particularly concerning in Florida because 775,000 individuals were with outstanding debts and therefore had their voting rights taken away. So, with the judiciary opinion seemingly set and state legislatures doing nothing to address that problem, what can we do now? Well, there are three main proposals that are becoming popular right now. First is the employment of automatic voter registration. Automatic voter registration is a process in which an individual is automatically registered to vote when they interact with a government entity, most likely the DMV. This would create a national bright line for voting, ensuring that returned citizens are aware of when they are able to vote and making sure that they are not fearful that they will get in trouble for false voting because they were unaware of their voting status. A second popular provision is the use of drug courts, which work in conjunction with community treatment and judicial supervision to keep individuals out of the incarceral system and prevent them from facing felony convictions in the first place. Drug courts are not only ways that we can keep people out of our prisons, but they also save us a lot of money. Arkansas boasts a pretty robust drug court system itself, and it costs the state $5 per day. Incarceration, however, costs the state $45 per day, making drug courts seem like a reasonable solution to this issue. However, one must acknowledge that 52% of drug courts acknowledge that funding is their main reason why they cannot accept individuals. And 89.4% of the individuals that would benefit from participation in a drug court program are not allowed to due to mandatory sentencing guidelines. The third and final solution to mitigating the impacts of felony disenfranchisement is ending prison gerrymandering. As I mentioned earlier, prison gerrymandering is when an individual is counted within the district of the prison instead of their home district when it comes to census counts. Advocates to end prison gerrymandering propose three main solutions. First is to ignore prisoners in census counts entirely, adding them to neither state totals nor to regional totals, and therefore not affecting the ways that district lines are drawn. Second is to count prisoners in their old address, adding them to state totals and to local totals, and therefore modifying the way in which districts are drawn. And finally is to count them in the address unknown section, in which they are added to the state total, but not added to any local totals, and therefore do not affect local districts. Another important thing that I believe must be done in order to mitigate the impact of felony disenfranchisement is to rebuild trust among returned citizens and incarcerated individuals. A Florida study found that recidivism rates are lower among those whose rights to vote were reinstated. However, at the same time, individuals charged with a felony and returned citizens are hesitant to interact with government agencies, therefore hesitant to vote and or register to vote, because they're scared they're going to get in trouble. So, if restoring an individual's right to vote would decrease the likelihood of them going to prison, but they're scared to vote, how can we break out of this cycle? Well, I propose community building dialogues, such as face-to-face relationships, mentorships, and civil service, because they are all ways that community and trust can be restored and create a sense of responsibility to and purpose in a space. So what is my final recommendation? Ideally, we would have universal voting regardless of one's relationship with incarceration. However, that is not likely to happen in the near future. Therefore, states should pursue interim policies that will mitigate the impacts of felony disenfranchisement by first counting individuals in their last known residence in order to keep representation as fair and true as possible. Second, expanding and strengthening our drug court systems to keep people out of our prison systems. Third, creating a national bright line that encourages people to go to the polls. Fourth, prohibiting felony financial disenfranchisement. And fifth, strengthening community integration programs. I also propose a new litigatory approach to ending felony disenfranchisement. When one considers the historical context of felony disenfranchisement codes, they are certainly tied to racism and racial power structures, which is in direct conflict with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which says that race is not a valid reason to disenfranchise a voter. By analyzing the intent and results of these laws and building a legislative intent case, litigators can argue that felony disenfranchisement provisions violate Section 2 of the VRA and therefore cannot be the law of the land. Ultimately, at the end of the day, what's important to remember is that incomplete representation is untrue representation. That's worth repeating. Incomplete representation is untrue representation. We must understand where our democracy has been, where we are now, and where we want it to be in order for things to get better. As Kimberly Haven stated, the biggest thing about this is that voting is the right of citizenship. Regardless of what someone did, they never stop being a citizen. These are two completely independent things. Thank you.
As far as our institutions go, which one has been more significant and more detrimental, I guess, in this issue? Has it been the courts or the legislation that's been passed?
I would say the legislation, because our courts operate on a system in which the executive has to abide by the roles of the legislature. So if there's not a legislative backing behind judicial rulings, it's invalid. So basically, the courts cannot operate without clear direction from the legislative branch. So there's, at the root of it, it is the legislatures enacting this policy and hurting individuals charged with felony across the country.
If you had the opportunity to conduct further interviews for the project, what would you like to have done? Maybe in a post-COVID world that we're hopefully in now. So,
I would love to find individuals for each of my case studies that could speak to me. I got to speak with Dr. Neil Sakabme, who worked in Florida, but he was based in DC, so it was kind of not the same thing. I would have loved to talk to somebody in Vermont and Arkansas, but obviously the issue with Vermont is A, it's really far, and B, it's such a non-issue there that there's nobody there to talk about it with, except Mr. Dunn did try to link me up with someone, but it didn't really go anywhere. I'd also love to talk to more incarcerated and returned citizens. I got to speak to Ms. Haven, but more views on that would have been really helpful.
committee members, I'm going to pass it on to you for the next few minutes.
Throughout your thesis, there was kind of a common theme of this is difficult. This is not something that's going to change overnight. It's going to take a lot of people to change it. What do we as regular citizens, what would be effective, the most effective?
So first and foremost, I think the cliche of hold your representatives accountable. You know, that holds true here, but at the end of the day, there's only so much holding accountable you can do. But what's really inspiring is the case of Florida. So in order for the Amendment 4 campaign to get on the ballot, it had to have, I forget the exact number of signatures, but a lot of community support in order to even go before the ballot, on the ballot. Additionally, it passed with 64.5% of the vote, which is massive community support. So by building grassroots efforts and by engaging in these dialogues, we can work against felony disenfranchisement. Also, the rebuilding trust aspect of my solution inherently relies on community members to interact with incarcerated individuals and returned citizens to actually work.
Right, and that involves mentorship.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you know if that is something that's actively being pursued in any states right now, or is that something that would need to be proposed?
So there are a lot of different programs in which individuals incarcerated are connected with individuals on the outside. It could be reading programs. I came across specifically reading programs, but there's also programs that teach people how to give haircuts. There's programs that help people get connected to get their GED. So programs such as those would fit within the scope of my Rebuilding Trust solution.
One of the things that really fascinated me in your proposal was the drug courts and the statistics with that. When a 5 are locked up for a drug offense, and it's so much cheaper, $5 a day versus $45 a day. How many states right now are using drug courts? Are there specific states where drug courts could be really helpful? Are they in Florida right now? I know that we're using them in Arkansas.
We're using them here in Arkansas. I'm unaware of exactly how many states employ drug courts across the country, but I know that Kentucky also employs drug courts, and they've also seen similar results to Arkansas, which shows that Arkansas is not a unique situation and that it saves the state money and decreases incarceration rates.
It seems like a really good solution.
It is. The issue is that drug courts have pretty high failure rates, but I attribute that to a lack of funding. But this lack of funding is often cited because of the high failure rates. So it's kind of this loop where it's, well, nobody's passing. Well, why is nobody passing? Because they don't have funding. Well, why don't they have funding? Because the state legislators do not believe in the program because nobody's passing. So it is going to take a bit of a gamble, but I do believe, based on what we've seen throughout this, drug courts are a great solution that I believe will lead to a benefit for the entire country.
Mr. Doe?
I'm just so proud of you.
Thank you.
It's just really inspiring to watch this process unfold. I'm watching you stand up there with such poise. How are you feeling right now?
You know, I prepared for a lot of questions, but not how are you feeling.
I know.
So, I mean, I'm nervous, but like, I was talking to Olivia before this. It's like a little nerves keeps you on your toes. So that's nice. It's crazy to see this entire process coming to an end. And I mean, I've been working on it since July, August, and now in a few minutes it's going to be over. It's just wild.
So that gets at my next question. Is it over for you, or has this sparked something?
That's a great question. I think that it's not over for me. I think that I would love to pursue a career or studies in government and democracy. I've particularly been inspired by my favorite section of the entire thing was one section that I couldn't include, which was theories, but also I love the rebuilding trust section. That was my favorite section to write in the entire paper. And the idea of building community organizations is something that's really inspiring to me, and that I might pursue in the future. Who knows?
Ms. King, down at the end.
I'm looking for a little synthesis here. In Human Geo, we've been talking about housing segregation and post-World War II policies regarding things such as redlining and racial steering. How much of the housing policies of that time period contributed to increased policing and therefore increased incarceration amongst minority populations?
Right, so I alluded to that in my presentation, that police forces would target communities of color and low-income communities because they had lower social capital, which is this idea that, like money, we can use our social clout to get us things we want. So in communities that have lower social capital, it's easier to make an arrest because there's less people that are going to show up to the police station and say, get my person out of jail. That's not going to happen in those communities, which were directly created through the process of redlining and racial steering. So basically they were, through this process of redlining and racial steering, communities were basically homogenized. They were forced to become racially homogenous and therefore making it easier to attack certain neighborhoods.
To the audience. Yes.
So talking about repeat offenders, what does that process look like, especially with paperwork? So in regards to how people are able to be processed, their paperwork, their systems of getting identification and all of these human rights back after they've been put in prison, and then going back, what happens to that process? Can you get them to try to vote again, to re-register? Is all of their stuff or not? Is it put on hold? What does that process look like?
So that's actually a really interesting question because we saw that exact issue in Florida. So if you picked up on it, Amendment 4 was passed in November 2018, but it wasn't until June 2019 that Governor Ron DeSantis signed the bill into law that required felony financial disenfranchisement. So in that, what is that, 7-month period, we see 75,000 Floridians registered to vote. But that number may seem pretty low. But what's important to know is that that's where the work of Dr. Nielsen Kaufman comes in. There are stories, horror stories of individuals that cannot figure out how much was owed, and that's partly due to record keeping and repeat offenses. It becomes unclear how much is owed, who it's owed to, and it's just very difficult to pay your debts. I have one quote actually that one individual who was trying to figure out how much he owed. Every time he looked, it was a different number. It was going up and then it was going down, and it was going up, it was going down. It wasn't clear how much he owed. And also, Dr. Sakami, when I was talking to him, you have to understand that some counties in Florida are extremely rural and therefore do not have extremely modern systems. And they were finding how much people owed in shoeboxes. County clerks were keeping debts in shoeboxes with note cards. And if you cannot physically go down to that county and flip through that shoebox for your note card, you would never figure out how much was owed and you would stay disenfranchised. Well,
I know that the topic of gerrymandering is like particularly interesting to me. So I was wondering, out of the three that you talked about, the three most popular ideas, like which one you think would be the most helpful and which one would be like the most, people would be most willing to make happen?
So I'm going to address that in two different parts. The ones that I think would be most helpful. I believe that we should count prisoners in their old addresses because we see that representatives that represent districts that hold prisons do not feel accountable to the prison population. That's empirically been proven. So I believe that we need to count individuals in their old addresses because also that is where their life is, that's where their family is, that's where their friends are, and therefore that's where all their interests are. So we have to make sure that interests align with representation. But you also asked, what do I think is the most reasonable or like most practical to actually be enforced? I think that for the meantime, I think that the address unknown section is probably most likely to actually be passed because it allows states to still increase their representation because they're added to state totals while not impacting local totals.
You kind of alluded to in the beginning of the presentation that this mainly affects the Democratic Party in terms of like incarceration and minority incarcerated prisoners. Has there been any efforts or has any presidents attempted to put this issue on their platforms? And seeing as now Biden is in control of the White House and that there seems to be a majority within like Congress, could there be any like legislation that could pass?
Well, yes. So the For the People Act and the Free Our Vote Act both included provisions that would end felony disenfranchisement. And when asked about this, Jen Psaki, who's President Biden's press secretary, said that President Biden is in favor of ending felony disenfranchisement. However, it's important to note that it was very fully known at that point that those bills were going nowhere. So if he actually does, and if push comes to shove and it becomes reasonable that felony disenfranchisement could pass, we would have to adjust our thinking on that. But yes, the For the People Act included a provision that would re-enfranchise returned citizens. Also, this is kind of adjacent to that question. For former Virginia governor, Virginia is one of the few states that still practices permanent disenfranchisement. In the state, they have a process in which you can apply for clemency and your right to vote can be reinstated. So his name was Terry McAuliffe, and McAuliffe reasoned that if he as governor has the right to clemency and to re-enfranchise individuals, he could do it in mass. So he re-enfranchised every single returned citizen in Virginia with a stroke of a pen. However, the Virginia Supreme Court overturned this due to the fact that it was beyond the intended use of clemency.
Reading your paper throughout the year has been a spectacular process. You did an amazing job. And I'm curious, throughout your paper, you had a series of personal stories and anecdotes from many returned felons and felons who were released from prison who were still disenfranchised. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on which story may be your personal favorite.
Yes. So there's this man named Mark Barley from Wyoming, and in 2020, he went to go cast his ballot in that year's election. However, in 2004 and 2007, he committed two unrelated felony offenses. Wyoming is actually the fourth state, excuse me, or I guess third state after 2018, that permanently disenfranchises returned citizens. So he was unaware of this, and he cast his ballot. And he was actually charged with another felony and sent to prison for a single day. And in an article I was reading about him, he said something along the lines of, he felt that he wanted to put his I voted sticker on a dartboard and throw darts at it because he felt that he had lost his voice and vote as an American citizen. And that was truly heartbreaking to read about someone being excited to go cast their ballot and then not being turned away. That's the issue, is that he wasn't turned away, but he was allowed to vote and then sent back to prison.
We took that out of the
That was in my presentation, but I didn't have time. Hello.
So, do you have any examples of election results that changed due to felony disenfranchisement?
Absolutely. So in 2000, that's perhaps the most notorious case. The 2000 election, extremely close, comes down to Florida. And George Bush carries Florida by 538 votes. And at the time, I want to say there was, I think it was 775,000 returned citizens that were disenfranchised in the state. And if they had been allowed to vote, it is estimated that Al Gore would have won the election by 40,000 to 80,000 votes, thereby winning him the presidency and thereby changing the future of America's education systems, foreign policy, and so many aspects of our society. Also, I think this one's particularly interesting. Mitch McConnell would not be in power. Mitch McConnell was elected in 1986 by just around a margin of 5,000 votes. During that election, Kentucky also disenfranchised, I believe it was around 75,000 returned citizens. And it was 75,000 returned citizens were kept to vote. And it is believed that if they had been allowed to vote, McConnell's Democratic opponent would have won by 11,000 votes. And that case is not alone. There were 7 other cases between 1986 and 2008 where a Senate seat would have flipped from red to blue, but none would have flipped from blue to red. Greedy.
Kind of going on something you mentioned earlier, is there anything within the, like, I know I have to cut a lot of stuff for my defense, is there anything else that got cut that you wish you could have brought to our attention?
So, as I alluded to earlier, I thought the theories behind felony disenfranchisement were really interesting. So, most of the theories go along the line of the social contract is the reason that any nation exists. And a social contract is an agreement among all those governed to abide by the rules of the land. So by breaking the law, you're therefore violating the social contract and therefore do not get to participate in the social contract. However, a plain reading of the social contract would lead to one concluding that any crime is worthy of disenfranchisement from even jaywalking. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau said something along the lines of, and this is in reference to the 14th Amendment, which allows for disenfranchisement for crime, for participation in rebellion or other crimes. Jean-Jacques Rousseau would consider any crime against the nation a rebellion because it is a rebellion against the social contract that holds it together. However, when one really starts to think about it, that doesn't really account for the truth of crime and criminality and why people truly commit crimes and what is driving them to do this. Additionally, the second popular theory is the Republican moral governance theory. Republicans not in reference to the political party in this sense. It's the idea that if you commit crimes, you show that you're not morally competent enough to participate in a democratic body and guide and follow the wills and desires of the polis, which is everybody, because you are working against it. However, I find that almost comical because I believe there are quite a few people that vote against the interests of everyone, and I think that it also does not account for the truth of crime and criminality.
All right, let's get a photo of committee members. Let's do that. Grab my phone if you want. Yeah, get it back to slide. Thank you, everyone. I know standing up for this entire time had to be not the most comfortable experience, but you're young, you'll get over it. Thanks again. I look forward to having you on the committee next year. We'll get through this.
All right. 1, 2, 3.
Oh, my.
I'm sorry. Sorry, I should have been ready.
Should have done your iPhone.
Okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3.
We can just talk over this, right? Angela, I think
How you feeling? parents?
I have to take a family picture.
That was good. It was good. That was so good. I don't even know if that's a choice.
Yeah.
All right, all right.
Why didn't you? We got time.
All right, all right. Awesome.
Thank you. Just give them a different marker. Give them a different marker. Thanks for coming.
All right. Oh. So good.
Thank you.
One thing down.
I'll find a Red Sox hat and black. And I'll send it
Okay.
I'll make the call right when I get out. We can't do better.
Thank you so much for everything.
I'll see you later. Rocky, you in here? Okay.
So we're changing to black for honors?
Yes.
Just like.
1, 2, 3. So these don't, every year we try to do someone. 21 out of 22 there.
Yeah, I know. Did you manage to send me? Yeah, that's what he asked.
So, how much?
Oh, you did sing your sister.
What about the look? I was gonna try to look that
I'm trying to think of some examples. So I think the example is really important. What was important about Melanie is the right and that's why it made so, but you can see, as like, whenever I was talking about, I didn't include in the presentation, but black, they were creating as like a lot of rapists and like specifically child rapists. And like any discussions about using despite like lower levels. Despite like their lower levels.
We'll see y'all in a little while.
So it's like they
Thank you guys for coming. Thank you.
really increase.
All right, I'll see you.
It's hard to say.
Yeah, right.
But
Harrison, I'm meeting you there. What time you be there?
about 30.
Okay, we'll see you there.
Okay.
Is there a particular momentum? Because there's also, is there a trend?
Right now, so I think from what I studied, I think things are getting better. I do believe that in my lifetime, we're losing but not before things get better. I think that especially in ideology, red states, like Florida, like, I don't know if Arkansas actually will, but I think Florida, like the states. Oh, this is an interesting stuff. So, and states that are purple states, Republicans are more likely to push for felony disenfranchisement harder than they would in So it's like Florida, I could see it becoming more intense. Virginia, I could see it becoming more intense. Minnesota has become more conservative. I could see it becoming more intense. Texas, I think in the near future, we are seeing it a little bit in Texas, but I think it's going to be really intense.
I'm curious, with the 64% positive vote, 36%, clearly, I think, felons and returned citizens on moral grounds say, you don't deserve, no, you don't deserve, you're not worthy. I don't want your vote. Whatever.
Returning voting rights to individuals on probation or parole goes quite well, with 60 to 68%, which is interesting considering 60 to 68% of Americans on both sides of the aisle agree with returning voting rights. Obviously, it's higher for Democrats and lower, but it's about 50%. So it's really interesting to see that. So,
but then you ask the question about felons in prison, and that becomes a really
problem. I didn't see any numbers on that. The issue with this is that states are really weird when it comes to releasing statistics about like who's voting, why they're voting, how they're voting. So it's difficult to see that, but I didn't run across any.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Hi people, I'm ending the stream now.